They say death is the great equalizer, but what if it could be cheated? In a town where the dead were honored with riches, one man saw an opportunity to rewrite his fate. Why struggle through life when death could bring fortune? But the grave is no place for the living, and in seeking to deceive the gods, he dug a pit far deeper than he ever imagined. Would his cunning lead him to wealth, or would he fall victim to the very earth he sought to betray? In the town of Nyakpala, where tradition was sacred, the dead were honored in a peculiar way. It was believed that no man should carry his poverty into the next life. So when a poor man died, the council gathered valuables, gold trinkets, silver rings, fine cloth, and buried them alongside him. It was their way of ensuring that even in death, he would not suffer. To Mephisu, this tradition was a gift, not to the dead, but to the living. A man could struggle his entire life and have nothing, yet in death, riches would be handed to him. What a waste! He had spent years watching graves filled with wealth while he walked the streets hungry. Why wait for death to take what could be used now? And so, he devised a plan. Mephisu would fake his own death. Let the town bury him with riches, and when the night was dark, he would rise from the grave, take the wealth, and disappear into a new life in another town. For months, he prepared. He ate little to look frail, coughed dramatically in public, and spoke in riddles about seeing the other side. He whispered strange things to passers-by, muttering about how the ancestors had begun calling his name. He even spent nights lying outside under the stars, refusing to enter his home, claiming he was already halfway to the land of the dead. When he finally collapsed in the marketplace one evening, wailing filled the air. Women slapped their thighs in grief, men shook their heads solemnly, and the council declared him dead. They didn't know Mephisu had only taken some herbs that would delay his breathing. As was custom, he was buried with enough wealth to live well in the afterlife. But unknown to him, others had also been watching. For years, grave robbers had been lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. They knew of the treasures buried with the poor and made it their mission to steal from the dead. The night Mephisu planned to wake from his grave, another man was already creeping toward it with a shovel in hand. That very night, the earth was damp from days of rain. The soil had softened, and the graves sat heavier in the ground. The grave robber, unaware that this particular grave was already occupied by the living, dug greedily. As his shovel struck the wooden coffin, Mephisu, lying within, gasped with sharp disbelief, but he kept his composure, thinking the sound only came from his mind. "Ah, it is time," he then said. Pushing against the wooden lid, he forced it open, only to find himself face to face with a stranger in the darkness. Their eyes locked. For a moment, neither moved. Then, as if struck by lightning, the grave robber let out a scream so shrill it sent shivers through the trees. He stumbled back, his mind spinning. Had the dead risen? Had he disturbed an angry spirit? He went through all the emotions, far too fearful for someone who steals from the dead. Mephisu, realizing the mistake, tried to speak. He tried to control the situation, but the robber just wouldn't calm down. It was as if this robber had seen what he wasn't meant to see, and before Mephisu could choose his words carefully, the ground beneath them groaned. The rain had softened the earth, and the grave, amidst their struggle, now open, could no longer hold. The walls suddenly collapsed, swallowing both men into the pit. Then came the rains, beating them so hard that they continued to sink. You could tell that luck was definitely not on their side at all. Trapped beneath the weight of the mud, the robber now cried even harder. Mephisu now joined in. They cried out for help. But who would believe the voices of the dead? It was a hunter who first heard them. On his way home, he froze in his tracks. His heart pounded. Had the spirits of the dead risen in anger? His skin prickled at the eerie cries rising from the cemetery. Panic seized him. Were their ancestors angry with them for something the community had done? He turned and bolted to the village, his feet barely touching the ground. His next stop was at the Elders' Council, where he burst through the doors, breathless and wide-eyed. The spirits of the dead. They cry out from beneath the earth, he gasped, his voice cracking with fear. The elders exchanged wary glances, the weight of his words sinking into the silence. Could it be an omen? A curse? Without hesitation, they sent word across the village, rousing the people from their sleep. By dawn, the whole town had gathered at the graveyard, murmuring prayers and gripping charms to ward off evil. The council elders, standing with authority, ordered the villagers to unearth the source of the cries. Hands worked swiftly, and soon the bodies of Mephisu and the grave robber were dragged from the pit, alive but exposed in their shame. Gasps of horror and betrayal filled the air. The people demanded justice. But as the elders prepared their judgment, another thought unsettled them. If one grave had been tampered with, how many others lay empty beneath their feet? A decision was made. All the graves from the last week would be reopened. One by one, the coffins were unearthed, their lids pried open. But what they found sent a chill through the crowd. Coffin after coffin lay bare, stripped of bodies and wealth. Shock turned to realization. More had faked their deaths. More had stolen from the very hands that had mourned them. The elders stood in silence, the weight of their tradition crashing down upon them. They had spent years honoring the dead, yet they had neglected the living. Turning to the crowd, the chief elder spoke, his voice heavy with sorrow. We have built golden tombs for empty souls. If only we had honored our people in life, perhaps they would not have deceived us in death. From that day forward, the village changed. No longer would wealth be buried beneath the soil. Instead, it would be used to uplift the poor while they still breathed, to show love before hands turned cold, to give respect before a name was carved in stone. As for Mephisu and the grave robber, they were sentenced to a lifetime of servitude under the council, working for the very people they had sought to deceive. And so, my dear listeners, that was how the village of Nyakpula learned a lesson that echoed through generations. Give a man his flowers while he can still smell them. For what use is gold in a grave?